Back in the days of film, 35mm was a really common focal length, and I've got three really nice ones to show you today. If you're looking for a really nice vintage 35mm lens, keep watching. Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in and welcome to another one. Today we're going to take a look at the Nikon 35mm f2.8 vintage lens. As I understand it, this lens has been made since 1959 in one form or another. There were many thousands of them sold, so there are loads around today at reasonable prices. They start around about £75 on buy it now on eBay. Probably you'll find one cheaper on an auction. So today we'll be looking at this lens, the Nikon 35mm f2.8, and we'll be comparing it to two other really nice vintage 35mm, the Olympus Zuiko 35mm f2.8 and the Carl Zeiss Jena 35mm f2.4. So here's the lens, and you can see that it's got all its caps and adapters and everything on at the moment. I've been shooting it on my Sony A7C, so let's take all those bits off and see the lens in all of its unclothed wondrousness. Here it is. It's a fairly small lens. These are not large lenses. It's very nicely made. It's an all metal lens in the tradition of vintage lenses. This lens has stood up to the rigours of the passing years very well. I think this is a fairly late model. The serial number on the face here suggests it's quite a late version of this lens, but as I say, it's been produced since 1959 in one form or another, with slight optical variations. There's the rear of the lens with the Nikon F mount. This lens has a 30cm minimum focus distance, so it gets pretty nice and close to whatever subject you're shooting. That's a usefully short minimum focus distance, and apertures run from f2.8 all the way up to f22, and as usual in the Nikon tradition we've got color coding for the aperture values, which I must admit I don't really tend to rely on, but I do like the aesthetic effect that they give. So a very nicely made lens for sure. So this is a very sharp lens all the way from wide open at f2.8, and it renders details very crisply and very clearly. I was quite surprised actually how sharp this lens is. So it's very sharp wide open. It gets a little sharper as you stop it down to f4, f5.6, f8, but to be honest, the difference isn't all that great. So unless you want a very sharp shot, an absolutely maximally sharp shot, then I would suggest you're okay to shoot this lens wide open all day long for as long as you like. I can't see too much difference in the wide open sharpness and the stop down sharpness. I guess that's in the nature of wide angle lenses. Generally speaking, the wider you go in focal length, you know, the wider a lens you have, then the sharper, generally speaking, an image that lens will give. So it does have inherent sharpness being a slightly wide angle lens, but that said, it is optically a very nice lens, and yeah, I was really quite surprised as to how sharp this lens shoots right from wide open at f2.8. It resolves details very clearly and crisply, and it makes very sharp images. Comparing it to the other two lenses in sharpness, well, to be honest, I can't see much difference between any of them. They all shoot pretty sharp from wide open. They all make images with lots of crisp detail, lots of resolution, loads and loads of detail going on. So I don't think it's noticeably sharper than the Carl Zeiss Jena lens or the Olympus Zuiko lens. If it is, there's not much in it. I haven't zoomed in really closely to see what those little pixels are doing and how absolutely sharp or otherwise they actually are, but certainly the subjective impression of looking at images from these lenses is there really isn't that much difference in them in sharpness. They all give a nice sharp image wide open, and they all give a nice sharp image stop down, which isn't that much sharper than shooting wide open. So generally similar results across the board for sharpness. All right, let's look at colour and contrast. And the lighting conditions weren't ideal. We've had some very diffuse light for the past couple of weeks, lots and lots of cloud cover. So not ideal for looking at colour and contrast. Nevertheless, we can make a good comparison with the images we have because they were all shot in the same light, all shot in that same grey, cloud covered, diffuse sort of light that we get so much of here in the UK. Having said that, let's check out the colours from each of these lenses, and we'll begin with the Nikon first. Well, now, colour from this lens is really nice. I like what this lens can do. These are not weak washed out colours, these are very definitely there. They've got plenty of presence and they've got some real depth, some body and some strength. We don't see from this lens what I've called in the past the Nikon colour palette, which is perhaps most evident in the 50mm f1.4 that I've shot and that's featured on the channel now and again. So that colour palette is a sort of one that emphasises blues and greens, and it's a very, very beautiful, very unique colour palette. Other Nikon lenses have it to some extent. This one doesn't show it. This one's a fairly neutral lens. It doesn't seem to be particularly warm. It doesn't seem to be particularly cool. It's just sort of, what can I say, somewhere in the middle, a fairly neutral sort of lens for warmth or coolness. So it gives some really nice colours with real good body and strength, and that is helped by this lens's really, really good contrast. It's a lens with some very good contrast, some good resonant dark tones and some bright white, bright tones, and we really see a good contrasty image coming out of this lens, and that helps colour. That really underpins the colour performance of any lens, is good contrast. So very nice colours. How do the other ones do? Well, we've got the Carl Zeiss Jena here. This one gives very, very strong, very, very good colours with plenty of depth, plenty of body, and it has very good contrast as well. And I think the Carl Zeiss Jena lens has slightly better contrast than the Nikon. So colours feel solid, they feel deeper, they feel more strong, and I think I do just prefer the colours from the Carl Zeiss Jena lens. The Nikon lens is not far behind it. It does have very good contrast, it does give colours with good body, strength and depth, but not quite as good as this Carl Zeiss Jena lens. If we look at the Olympus lens, let me just pop that one down somewhere. If we look at the Olympus lens, well, that's quite a different story. It's got noticeably less contrast than either the Nikon or the Carl Zeiss Jena lens. This little Zuiko has noticeably less contrast than either of them. Images seem that little bit weaker. Colours are just that little bit lacking in depth, strength. They seem just a little bit washed out when compared to the other two lenses. So the CZJ, the Carl Zeiss Jena, takes the colour competition, I think, but only just. The Nikon is only just behind it. Unfortunately, the Olympus, which I had hoped for a better performance from, does seem some way behind it. Alright, let's think about background blur. Well, now this, or any other 35mm, come to that, is not the kind of lens that you'd buy with background blur at the forefront of your mind. This is a wide angle lens designed really for wide images, you know, full of space and light and air. So we're not primarily thinking of a 35mm lens as a blur monster. However, they can create some, and this Nikon is no exception. It's generally very nice. It tends to be very smooth, very lovely up close, especially if you go to the minimum focus distance. It's very smooth and soft at minimum focus distance. Background blur will persist at longer distances, up to about a meter or so away from your subject, and it's generally nice and smooth, and it can give some very nice bubbles from point light sources in the back of a shot. However, at longer distances the blur can become a little rougher, especially if straight lines are in the background, and occasionally it does jar a little bit. You can shoot around it to some extent, but if you've got lines in the far background and you're shooting up to a distance of about a meter or so, you're likely to see a little bit of roughness if the background is at the distance that will create that roughness. Generally it needs to be in the fairly far background. So generally nice blur, very soft at closer distances. It persists up to about a meter or so. Nice specular highlight, nice bubbles rather from specular highlights, but it can become a little rough if there are straight lines in the background. And you know what, that goes for all these lenses here. The Carl Zeiss Jena and the Zuiko are both similar. The Carl Zeiss Jena is perhaps slightly nicer than the others, but that's only a perhaps, and if it is slightly nicer, there really isn't that much in it. These three are more or less equal when it comes to background blur. The Carl Zeiss Jena, of course, has an advantage in the amount of blur it can make, because its minimum focus distance is a tiny 20 centimeters. It will even go a little closer than 20 centimeters. I've found it will go down to about 19 centimeters. So if you're shooting at that minimum focus distance, gosh, yeah, you're going to get loads of blur from this Carl Zeiss Jena over here. Oh, here it is. This will give you plenty of blur at the minimum focus distance of 20 centimeters. The other two, the Nikon and the Zuiko, only go down to 30 centimeters, so they have less blur potential at closer distances. All these lenses seem to vignette a little bit when they're wide open. They'll give slightly dark corners, which if you stop down, turn the aperture dial and stop down, those dark corners become somewhat brighter. They all show that effect to some extent. Maybe the Carl Zeiss Jena has less of it, but if it does, again, it really isn't by much. All show a little vignetting, and in all of the lenses that vignetting is significantly reduced by f5.6 to the point where you can say that it's pretty much gone. Chromatic aberration, well, the Nikon lens does show some of that. That seems to affect Nikon lenses, and I might be going out on a limb here. Please do correct me if you think I'm wrong, but the Nikon lenses I've shot, chromatic aberration seems to affect them a little more than it does some others. It's been present on all the Nikon lenses that I've shot. It's certainly present on this one, and I think this one has just a tiny bit more than the others. The other lenses, the two other lenses, do show a touch of it also, but I think perhaps the Nikon has just slightly more. The Carl Zeiss Jena gives slightly less, The Zuiko, maybe that too gives slightly less. So I think, generally speaking, the Nikon comes out worst for chromatic aberration, but again, it isn't by very much. As regards price, well, a Nikon lens, 35mm f2.8 Nikon lens, I've been checking today. Prices seem to go between £75 to about £120, £130. Haven't these vintage lens prices gone up? I did pay £75 for this one just recently. You can probably get one for less than that. That was buy it now, but I needed one fairly quickly. And these are representative prices of roughly what's being asked now, about 75 to 120 for the Nikon. For the Zuiko, which turned out to be not quite as good a lens in this test, that actually seems to be more expensive. They go, at least asking prices, go from around about £100 to £150. The Carl Zeiss Jena is a little more expensive again. That is something of a legendary, iconic lens in this company. That goes from around about 150 to around about £200. I saw one today advertised for 260, but that's a bit silly unless it's pretty much new in its box. Carl Zeiss Jena lens is a little more expensive. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my mic. That lens is a little more expensive. So about 75 to 120 for the Nikon, about 100 to 150 for the Olympus, and about 150 to 200 for the Carl Zeiss Jena. The Nikon is a very, very solid performer. It's a very, very capable lens. However, it can't quite do what the Carl Zeiss Jena can do. It doesn't have that wonderful minimum focus distance, and it doesn't have the f2.4 aperture, so it's not quite as good a lens in that regard. The Carl Zeiss Jena also gives a very slightly nicer image, I think. Certainly that's what this test has suggested, but there really isn't much in it. If you want a vintage Nikon 35mm, this one is a really, really nice lens. If you particularly want a Nikon, if you're a Nikon collector, or if you want one for some other reason, this is a really nice one to buy. However, if you want a lens that can do a little bit more, I'd save a few more pennies and get the Carl Zeiss Jena. The differences in prices between these lenses seems to be narrowing a little bit, and all the other vintage lenses seem to be coming up in price. And we're now at a point where this lens and the price of, come here, where are you? The Carl Zeiss Jena lens can sort of overlap. So in the £100 to £150 region, the prices of these two can overlap. So I would suggest, if you want the nicest vintage 35mm, save up a bit longer and get a Carl Zeiss Jena. So there we are, 3 lovely 35mm vintage lenses, all of which will give you a nice image, 2 of which will give you a really, really nice image. That is the Carl Zeiss Jena and the Nikon. The Zuiko has not come out terribly well in this test. It doesn't seem to have the strength of colour, the strength of contrast, and in the final analysis, the strength of image that the other two have. So unfortunately, it's not the winner on this test. The Nikon is a very, very worthy contender. It gives a fantastic image with good body, good contrast, lots of depth in its image, and very good sharpness. They all give good sharpness. But coming out on top is the Carl Zeiss Jena Pancolar. This, for my money, at least as far as this test goes, is one of the nicest vintage 35mm you can buy. But if you can't quite stretch to it, the Nikon is a really, really good second. So that is about it from me for now. Many thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this episode, you might like to chuck us a sub. That would be very much appreciated. Many thanks go to subscribers. Thank you very much for that support. That is really appreciated. And many thanks go to patrons. Thank you very much for that support. That is really appreciated. Thank you for all your support. And if you like the content on this channel and you'd like to support what we're doing, you might want to become a patron yourself. You can do it over at www.patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do that for as little as $1 per month. As for me, that's it from me for now. But if you're not doing anything too bothersome, irritating or annoying next week at around this time, please do join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.